Fire on the Mountain, Chapter 1, Part 7. She woke up in a cold sweat. No wonder the clouds were gone, and the million stars were glaring down at her over the mountain. Trembling, she gathered up her blanket and went inside. It wasn't true that the dead wanted you to be happy. They resented being dead alone. Harriet was asleep on the couch. The letters were at her feet, arranged in chronological order. One shoe had dropped off, and when Yasmin slipped it onto her daughter's foot, the shoe helped out. They would be great for babies. Babies wouldn't care how they looked. She laid down with her little fire. She decided to tell Harriet that she was pregnant tomorrow, then tell Pearl the next day when they were back in Staunton on the way home to Nova Africa. Watching the Mars landing while Pearl wept. Yasmin wasn't looking forward to any of it. It seemed I had a horse. Deal wanted, sees her, gentled, so he didn't mind me riding him night or day. That night I went to see Cricket out at Green Gables, the plantation 2 miles out of town where Mama had lived before she'd been bought by old Deal. Like most townfolk, I had mixed feelings about field slaves. They seemed ignorant, passive, backward, yet I was drawn to them inexplicably, as if toward a dream I had forgotten and was trying to remember. There were almost 30 Africans at Green Gables, and they usually knew the truth of things, since the plantations were on the pea vine that didn't pass through town. Like a fool, I was as excited by the horse as by the raid, but Cricket soon set me straight. "Once we get freedom," he said, "then we'll have all the horses we want." It began to dawn on me that the fighting in Harper's Ferry had some purpose besides making the white folks angry and providing me with a little excitement. "I saw them this morning," I said. "Honest, they were walking into town, all with guns, and one of them—" "Hush," Cricket said, rapping the top of my head with his big knuckles. "Learn to keep your big mouth hushed up." I almost cried, he hit so hard. Cricket was 3 years older than I, and when you're 12, that seems like a century. Cricket was my cousin. He was my mentor, my secret idol, the big brother I then thought, had. All the black folks were talking about the raid anyway, so I didn't see why I couldn't. There was a granny woman at Green Gables, and she said that God would send a sign of deliverance, a fire on the mountain. Sure enough, as soon as it got darker, we saw it, blazing like a star that had come down and landed right on top of the ridge. All the talking stopped. All you could hear was wood and leather hinges creaking and children being hushed as everybody came out of the cabins and stood there, watching, watching, watching. "Fire on the mountain," the granny woman said. "They up there sharpening they swords." Then she said that word again. Freedom. It had a shivery ring to me, and I wasn't sure I liked it. I was afraid of granny women anyway. I told Cricket, and he told me to hush up again, then put his arm around my shoulder, as if to apologize. And we stood there watching. I was nervous. I was afraid the white folks would see us and know what we were thinking. I looked behind me to the big house, but the curtains were all drawn. The granny woman must have seen me look around, or maybe others had done the same. "They trembling, just like in the Bible," she said. "Trembling, just like in the Bible." The fire blazed on, and I finally went home. July 25th, 1859. Miss Laura Sue Hunter, Miss Colby's School, Richmond. Dearest Lee, little Laura Sue, while I agree with you that marriage is a betrayal of both love and freedom, I don't agree about Latin. It may seem a dead language now, but Latin is the language of learned discourse everywhere, not just in medicine, and as our age of science advances towards its noon, it will be read and written more, rather than less. Believe me, there are those who would remove it from a young lady's curriculum. Do not make their work easier. I'm glad you liked the poems I sent. I'm not surprised that your teacher prefers Milton to Lord Byron. You must hardly expect one whose job it is to keep you in a condition below that of man, and above that of the slave, to commend you to those whose calling it is to show you the very stars. I say this to encourage, not discourage, your studies. For while Miss Colby's is not Harvard, it will afford you some knowledge, and while our father has many old-fashioned ideas, he is at least enlightened enough to educate his daughter, and that can't be said of many of his generation. I can appreciate the excitement there, but no, I do not regard Brown as a great Satan, nor do I think it is the end of the world. Do you not think it only just that the slave who has such willing oppressors should also find willing friends? I'm afraid, however, that Brown will pay dearly for his boldness, and yes, humanity when the army brings him down. I share these sentiments, of course, with none in the family but you, your loving brother, Thomas. Grave robbing! Brown and Tubman left behind no wounded, but 4 dead, who were ignorantly and drunkenly abused and mutilated, then buried in a common grave in the mud of the Sycamore Flats near the Shenandoah. A week later the graves were robbed. The story whispered around was that some among the black folk had given them a proper hero's burial. Well, that was not to be tolerated. The local authorities finally had something they could get their teeth, such as they were, into, and on the testimony of an ignorant house nigger called Jameson, arrested Granny Lisbeth at Green Gables and carried her into Charlestown, caparisoned in chains. They tried to make her walk, but she wouldn't, so they brought her in a wagon escorted by 6 militiamen in matching outfits on horses with matching Hall's patterns muskets. It was quite a show for the 120-year-old woman. Mama all but tied me to the stove, but since Deal needed me in the stable and was too busy to keep track of me, what with all the journalists and railroad men in town, I managed to get to the courthouse twice on the day she was tried. I watched them bring her in, and I watched the crowd outside in the courthouse when it was all over. White folks had come from miles around, and one of them called out in the proceedings from the courthouse door to all those who couldn't fit into Charlestown's tiny courtroom. You have to understand that these Virginians had never seen an African in a courtroom before. It was unusual to them as trying as a horse, and the fact that it was all happening at all was an indication of the utter strangeness of things since Brown's raid. Well, Jameson was brought in, but now said he didn't remember anything. The crowd in the courtroom booed. The prosecutor slapped Jameson, the judge admonished the prosecutor, and Jameson cried, and the crowd in the square laughed and ate fried chicken. As for Granny Lisbeth, they had 3 lawyers against her and only 1 for, but still she lost, as that old joke goes. After a 1-hour trial, she was found guilty of defacing a Christian grave. Christian, since 2 of the 4 dead were white men. I have always fancied that one of them was a boy I saw on the road, and sentenced to a public whipping, the first in this part of Virginia in almost 20 years, although in the more elegant Tidewater such traditions die more slowly. Well, Granny Lisbeth, who was approaching 120, she claimed, and we believed such things in those days, and had even less in life to fear than the rest of us Africans, though mostly we did not know it yet, barred up her yellow teeth, the crier said, and threatened to call up the very fires from hell if any man, jack or devil, so much as laid a hand on her. The judge, looking over his shoulder, suspended her sentence on account of her advanced age and decrepit condition, and sent her home in the same wagon, without the chains. She rode out with her chin in the air like a conquering hero, and no wonder. A few of the white folks in the crowd booed and hollered, but most were dead silent. Like the judge, they were looking over their shoulders. Like me, they were afraid of granny women. Such was the state of mind among the whites the first week after the raid. Scared, but angry. Angry, but scared. Governor Wise of Virginia said the question of the outlaws up on the mountain was a federal matter, since it had been a federal arsenal that had been raided. President Buchanan said it was a state matter, since the raiders had never left Virginia. Wise said they had come from Maryland. Governor Know-Nothing Hicks of Maryland said they had committed no crimes in Maryland that he knew of. Buchanan pointed out that the Sabotage Railroad bridge terminated in Maryland. Hicks said Buchanan, who was 67, was too old to know with any certainty one end of a bridge from the other, etc. It felt like summer, with a storm in the air waiting to cut loose. I kept looking over my shoulder, too, like the judge, but I was looking for something else, though I didn't know yet what it was. I helped deal with the horses twice a day and helped Mama with her kitchen, both of which chores had fairly doubled. The Harper's Ferry Railroad Bridge was still not fixed, and in the meantime eastbound as well as northbound trains were being routed through Martinsburg and Hagerstown, so Charlestown was getting all the traffic Harper's Ferry used to get, plus its own. Not the Charleston you know, great-grandson, the great Nova Africa seaport, but Charlestown, a dusty little Virginia county seat where the idiocy of rural life reigned unchallenged. The town was filled with government men, railroad men, newspaper men, plus the usual slave brokers, cattle buyers, and timber appraisers, most of them with horses, the rest needing them, and many of them, at least the lower elements, turning up at Mama's for cornbread and beans. The gentlemen and upper-grade government men ate at the Planters or at the Shenandoah and Harper's Ferry. John Brown had been good for business. Meanwhile, the fire on the mountain burned, and the black folks said nothing. Little to the white folks, and even less among ourselves. Later that week, an ignorant house nigger named Jameson was found with his throat cut. The next week came Iron Bridge. End of part 7.